Who are some of the guys that you would say that you've learned from in terms of the more of like the professional type, maybe physicists or philosophers or whatever?
Well, most of the people I've learned the most from are the people I disagree with. Um, the my formative uh, uh, my formative experience was back in the 70s with Richard Dawkins and his infamous uh, work on evolution, the selfish gene. That kind of got me started because I was a teenager at the time. I was just trying to figure out what on earth was going on around me. And he had some extremely interesting and pretty important things to say, but there was always something that sort of bothered me about it, and he never quite. He was trying to prove a point, and he did a good job of explaining why it's an important point, but never really quite made the point. He never proved his thesis. Essentially, he just he just managed to make a good argument for why it's a possible thesis without ever actually being able to say, and this is why it must be so. That kind of got me started. And then, of course, I did the whole through my early 20s and mid 20s. I did the a kind of generic soul searching, looking for a religion that works, or a philosophy that works, or a scientific answer for what's going on in terms of what's in my head and what's in everybody else's head.
And sorry to cut you off, but what was Dawkins' theory that he didn't quite prove? Do you feel like
the selfish gene? Are you familiar at all with the book, The Selfish
I'm
Gene?
familiar with Dawkins, but I haven't read the book.
Right. Well, it was kind of Dawkins' first really big book. It's what made his name in this entire realm. And his basic theory is one of adaptive altruism. And can altruism, or goodness, or morality, or helping others, compassion, whatever you want to call it, is that a genetic trait of human beings, or is it not? And the alternative theory is always, well, if it's not a genetic trait, then it's kind of just something we make up, so it doesn't really matter, so it doesn't really exist. And that kind of leaves you with you either accept that it must be an adaptive evolutionary trait, something biological and genetic that we evolved, and perhaps all other mammals have as well, or else it's completely a figment of our imagination. It's subjective, and it should be completely ignored because everybody just has their own idea of what's moral and good. And ultimately, it turns out, I now realize, that's kind of a false dichotomy, and that's the problem with some of that approach. But basically, his argument was that adaptive altruism is possible because of three general mechanisms in biological evolution. One of which is kin selection, one of which is I can't remember the term for it now. It's groups of genes that get passed along simply because they happen to be near each other on the DNA strands. And since the mechanisms that break up the DNA for replication don't actually begin and end at gene spots, at gene stop and start points, sometimes this can cause two different genes that have essentially nothing to do with each other. They can still get passed on as if they were biologically linked, simply because they're close to each other on the sequence of our DNA. And the third one is the one that actually started the modern usage of the word meme. He kind of invented the word meme at the time, but he was more or less adapting the root from the word memory and all the other uses of MEM in terms of mental stuff that we do, which eventually became what we call memes, which isn't necessarily really directly related to what Dawkins was talking about. But did
the name meme that we know of with like the little graphics, did that kind of derive from
graphics with text? Well, meme.
Did that derive from his?
Yes,
from his.
That derived. That's where the word came from. It's not where the usage came from. The word was actually he coined the phrase, the word meme to be the essentially the intellectual, the mental, the neurological, I should say, the neurological equivalent to the gene. Where have you ever heard information is a virus, right? Where a bit of knowledge or an idea gets passed from brain to brain and gets replicated through our brains, through our using these ideas and communicating them to other people. And so knowledge is a virus. That was his basic idea. Now, the problem with the approach, as far as his argument for the basis of adaptive altruism, or the existence of morality, if you will, is that there isn't any physical analog to the gene. Genes we know physically exist. We can chemically identify them. They're even though they're kind of difficult to understand in a way, because it's the information in the sequence of amino acids, not the amino acids themselves, which are the gene. There's still a physical basis to genetics. Memetics, or the idea that knowledge is a virus, or ideas are memes, the way DNA is genes. That doesn't. It works as a metaphor, as an idea maybe, but it falls apart as a scientific approach because there isn't any code underlying memes. Now, that was his basic idea. The idea that knowledge is like a virus. Well, then you get the internet, which didn't happen for another couple of decades after he coined this word meme, and the profundity of the idea of viral communications became more obvious to everybody, and so that was put together in a very well, just a day-to-day kind of way, not on purpose by any particular person, but that got put together with his use of the word meme. And that's how we came up with calling pictures with text on them that have a viral intellectual point, calling those memes. So he wasn't intentionally identifying that kind of thing, and he certainly didn't have anything specific in mind about, pictures with text on them, graphics with text, and internet memes. But that is why we call them memes, is because of Richard Dawkins and his book, The Selfish Gene.
But what part do you feel like he didn't prove with well, there's also, not to get off on this tangent, but there's also mean, or mene, right? MENE, which is like, isn't mene like the it's like the I want to say it's like the first like the first cell or whatever. Have you heard the term mene before? Or?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
If you're able to look it up, I might have to look it up, because
I'll have to look into that.
So in terms of what he said, though, about
adaptive altruism.
Yeah.
And
So
why I didn't think he really made his point.
Yeah, and I also do kind of want to get into evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology too. And do you know anything about? It sounds like you know about that, right?
Yeah, I'm
So yeah. All right, I'll have to look up the word mean. I'm not finding what I thought it was, but yeah, I guess I could be wrong about that, but I'll get back to you on that. But so yeah, in terms of in terms of disproving his point, you don't personally think that what he's kind of saying is that or what do you disagree with the effective altruism?
Essentially, it's that that altruism, goodness, morality, compassion for others isn't a genetic trait of human beings. It's an intellectual trait of consciousness. It's something that any consciousness is going to do because of the nature of consciousness, but it's completely unrelated to the biological precursors that generate the consciousness. And so I don't think so. He was trying very specifically, very intentionally, and intensely, in fact, to support this idea of compassion being a genetic mechanism, an adaptive trait, adaptive altruism. And I don't think he made his point. And in fact, over the decades since then, I managed to work out really why not only isn't altruism adaptive, but it can't be adaptive, because as soon as it's biologically adaptive, it's not altruism anymore. It's just biological existence. It's just self-serving, selfish genes. See, the thing about the one of the things about that book that encapsulates the whole idea, the whole issue of the selfish gene, of this genetic idea of adaptive altruism, is the title, because it's kind of a joke. It's kind of a trick that he played, because the way it's put, if you don't know anything about, or I should say, if you didn't know anything about things that many of us know so much about now these days, back in the 70s when he published this book, a title, The Selfish Gene, gives the idea, it presents a suggestion that there would be a gene for selfishness. And that if we don't have a gene for selfishness, then we would be selfless, then we would be compassionate all the time. But his real thesis, which is this is absolute scientific fact, incontrovertible, is that all genes are selfish. They can only, and that was his point, was genes only replicate adaptively in terms of evolving in ways that are good for that gene. Genes can't reproduce more effectively other than by reproducing themselves more effectively. So all genes are by nature selfish in that way, if you want to use the term. They're only self-interested. And he wanted to disprove, he wanted to overcome that idea by saying, yes, but there are these mechanisms by which this apparently impossible idea of a biological basis, a genetic benefit to being altruistic or compassionate or good, of helping each other. Well, it can overcome the selfish nature of genes and produce a selflessness, an altruistic adaptation, which once it's there will benefit itself by benefiting others. And so the basic idea is, if you have a population of replicators, of organisms that are just reproducing genetically and will therefore be the results will be controlled by natural selection, then if you have one organism within that population which has a mutant gene different than its parents had, which because of the mutation that occurred, it provides that organism the ability to be altruistic, to help other organisms within that population. The idea of adaptive altruism is by helping others within that population, since it exists within that population, it would therefore be of benefit to itself. This is called a doctor gene, right? Because you have a population that's all got that. All of the organisms have this gene called the warrior gene. They fight. They conquer other environments and other creatures outside their population, and by doing so, they benefit. But if you have one organism with a mutant warrior gene that turns out to be a doctor gene, so that it can help the warriors by fixing them up when they take damage during the battles that the warriors create, well, that would help the organism with the doctor gene by helping its society. And it gets very difficult to even describe what the problem that comes up is when you do this kind of reasoning, especially when it's me against Richard Dawkins, who is considered to be an extremely intelligent and well-educated man. The problem is that argument simply doesn't work, because the one doctor gene organism is going to help the warrior gene organisms reproduce, but within its population, it has no adaptive advantage. So the doctor gene isn't going to increase in frequency. So adaptive altruism is genetically impossible, according to the rules of evolution, of the fact that all genes can only increase in frequency in the gene pool if the trait that they result in increases the frequency of those genes in the gene pool, if it helps itself, if it's a selfish gene. And doctor genes, by definition, can't be. They have to help other genes produce more, reproduce more than the doctor gene itself does, the organism with the doctor gene. So it doesn't really matter how you work it, try and work it out. Altruism cannot be genetically adaptive. It is always going to be a sacrifice for the individual creature, which will make it less reproductively successful within that population, or else whatever that trait is that you're referring to, it's not altruistic. It's not self-sacrificing. It's self-serving. So it all comes down to a kind of epistemological argument of definitions about whether or not you call something adaptive or maladaptive. And the way people, the basis that people have for their argumentation these days, once you get into that tar pit, there's no getting out. In fact, I got to admit, I got banned from the R Philosophy subreddit for having just that very same argument. And all I was doing was trying to explain how genetic population studies use the word maladaptive in a way that doesn't make a general sense. It works perfectly fine for the uses they have for it, but it doesn't work in a general sense if it does not identify a self-sacrificing behavior as maladaptive.